Hi, this is Patrick Scott. Welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. During this session, we're going to continue talking about the presidency and specifically some of the basic powers that he has. And as part of that discussion, we're also going to be talking about this idea of the institutional presidency and the various actors and players and agencies that play a role in helping the president do his job. Now, going back to talking about the presidency and the president's powers, we were talking before about various powers like the veto power, impoundment, line item veto, pocket veto, those kinds of powers. Now, as we continue our discussion, another important operational power of the president is the power to recognize other countries. We talked about, in terms of constitutional powers of the president, the power to receive ambassadors to engage in diplomatic relations. Well, a variant or corollary to that is this idea that the power to recognize other countries or the other country's right to exist. And that is a very important power that the president has. I mean, this is especially important because think about what this does. The president, who is the leader of the most powerful nation in the world, decides when a new country declares its independence, if our president says, I choose to recognize your actions of declaring independence, I choose to recognize you as a new nation, what does that do around the world? That confers the legitimacy of the actions of that country to declare independence. And so because it confers legitimacy on that action, it's a very important power. I'll give you an example of this. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, President George H.W. Bush immediately recognized three Baltic nations, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, after they declared their independence from the Soviet Union. And so as part of that, it basically, we established diplomatic relations with these countries, and again, it conferred the legitimacy of the actions the world over. So immediately after President Bush had recognized, had given or granted formal recognition to these countries, immediately other countries, particularly those in Western Europe, but others as well, immediately also took action to recognize their status as independent nations. So that's a very important power that the president has. Now, another operational power of the president is the power to sign executive agreements and executive orders. And I want to talk a little bit about both of these, executive agreements and executive orders. Executive agreements look like treaties. They have the legal force of treaties, but they do not require Senate approval. As you may remember in our discussion about the constitutional power of the president shared with the Senate is to approve treaties. And as you also may remember, the Senate, it requires a 2/3 approval or vote in the Senate to approve a treaty. 2/3 of the members have to approve a treaty before it has the effect of law. Well, as you may think, if you're a president and you're signing or trying to craft a treaty with another nation, a very, very important treaty, and let's say, for example, that the Senate is controlled by the other party. If you're a Republican president and the Senate's a Democrat, and the Senate is controlled by the Democratic majority, it may be very difficult to get muster 2/3 approval of senators on this treaty. So it may actually make you as president look bad in the process of trying to craft a treaty, sign a treaty, and then it actually falls flat on its face. So because of this, as you might imagine, presidents have resorted to other means to achieve their role in conducting foreign policy. And one of these has been through the mechanism of executive agreements. So executive agreements have the legal force of treaties, and basically they are an agreement between the president and another country, and maybe between the president and a foreign head of state, and they are often used now instead of treaties. Again, this is a way in which the president can bypass the Senate because they do not require Senate approval. So as you might, if you looked at some data showing the number of treaties versus the number of executive agreements over the past 50 years, the number of executive agreements has skyrocketed compared to the number of treaties that have been signed. Now, to be fair about this, if the treaty is important enough, the president wants to work with Congress, and if it's significant enough, it's big enough in scope, that really should be saved for Senate approval. And oftentimes executive agreements are smaller in scope and nature. It might be like cooperative or scientific exchange agreement with another nation or some other things like this. But again, it can be a mechanism that the president can use to bypass the Senate. Again, think about the president as an institution and Congress as an institution, and a balance of power going back and forth, sort of a pool for prerogatives and influence among each of these bodies. And so this can be a way for the president to bypass the Senate in terms of getting his prerogatives achieved in the area of foreign policy. Now, more recently, there's also been something called the use of congressional executive agreements. Congressional executive agreements are basically a law, essentially, instead of a treaty. It's negotiated by the president, maybe, for example, a trade pact with another country. It's negotiated by the president, approved by the president, but then submitted to both houses of Congress for approval. This case, it only requires a majority vote in both houses of Congress as opposed to a 2/3 vote in one house, that is the Senate. In some cases, even though it may have to go to two houses, it's easier to get a majority vote than to get a supermajority vote in terms of 2/3 vote in the Senate. So these congressional executive agreements have been something that we begin to see an increase in as well. So this again might be a nice hybrid between an executive agreement where the president's acting alone and then a treaty where the president's having to get the approval of the Senate with 2/3 majority. And in a lot of ways too, if you think about this, the president would be smart, to the extent he's able to do this, is to confer with members of Congress in engaging in actions of that dealing with other countries. So when we're talking about foreign policy, to the extent that you can get members of Congress on board with your actions and thereby get the American people on board with your actions, I think you're going to have an easier time than if you're trying to go it alone. Now, besides executive agreements then, we also have executive orders. Now, executive agreements, like I said, look like treaties, act like treaties, but bypass Senate approval. Well, executive orders are similar to that. It's a rule or a regulation that has the effect of law. It looks like a law, it acts like a law, it has the effect of a law, but it bypasses congressional approval. Congress does not get the ability, in this case not just the Senate, but Congress as a whole, does not have the ability to say anything about executive orders. These are orders that are issued by the president. It might be, for example, again, they tend to be limited in scope, but it might be like, for example, an order mandating that federal employees be subject to drug testing. There's an example that comes to mind several years ago of showing how the Congress has tried to reassert its authority, trying to undo executive orders. And I'll give you an example here. Congress had passed, we'll do this, sometimes they'll pass a law with an amendment, and that amendment may be designed specifically to undo an executive order. All right, so the president has an executive order, Congress passes a law, attaches an amendment to that law, and then again, because the president has a line item veto power, has to sign that law, signs that law into place, even though the amendment may undo an executive order. Okay, so again, it's kind of interesting, this play, this game, if you will, that takes place between Congress and the president. In any case, there was one in which I remember when there was a House amendment that was sponsored by a Republican representative from Colorado, and Bill Clinton was president. And it was attached to a spending bill. It was a little bit unrelated to the bill itself. And basically there was an executive order that Bill Clinton had signed that added homosexuals to the groups that may not be discriminated against in federal employment. Well, this amendment proposed by this Republican member of Congress from Colorado basically was designed to undo that executive order. Now, Bill Clinton's executive order really sought to make uniform a federal employment policy that was already in place in many federal agencies. But the representative sought to rein in Bill Clinton on this because he believed that Bill Clinton was abusing his power in issuing a blizzard of executive orders during his time, during his 2 terms. And what this member of Congress had suggested was that the amendment was really not about rights of gays, but instead, or about a discrimination, but instead, he was making the argument it was about the misuse of the president's, or the misuse of the executive order process, because it was his view and those of other members of Congress who believed that the executive orders process was not designed or should not be designed to circumvent the role of Congress. But again, as you might imagine here, one of the ways in which Congress might try to assert its authority is to undo executive orders that the president has done. So the bottom line is this, is that the president could potentially use executive orders in a lot of ways to bypass the legislative process, but do so with the idea, with the understanding or the risk that in the process of doing that, there may be some legislation that arrives on his desk that will contain provisions unrelated to the bill that undoes the very executive orders that he had signed earlier. All right, so anyway, that's again one of the, understand the idea of executive order. It looks like a law, it has the effect of a law, the legal force of a law. Often it tends to be a little bit more limited in scope. Oftentimes it tends to apply with respect to the president's managing of the executive branch and may apply to federal employees, but it may go beyond that as well. So again, that we see a very important power of an example of how the president is sometimes tries to bypass the Congress if he can't get Congress to agree on certain provisions. Now, other powers of the president, a very important power that flows from his authority as commander-in-chief is the power to commit troops overseas. And many presidents have obviously used this even in times when the Congress has not declared officially an act of war, because Congress has the right to declare a war. But sometimes the presidents have used their authority as commander-in-chief to commit troops engaging in various kinds of police actions or something without being a formal war per se. Now, the Congress decided in 1973, again when Richard Nixon was president, to issue something called the War Powers Resolution. And again, this was again an override over the president's veto. But basically, what the War Powers Resolution of 1973 said is that the president does have the right as commander-in-chief to commit troops for 60 days and up to 90 days if they have an extension of 30 days. So really up to 90 days. But then those troops have to be withdrawn unless Congress approves. So again, this is Congress trying to assert its own prerogatives and authority in the area of foreign policy derived from its authority to declare a war. And so again, you see the two coming into play. There may be situations where the president needs to take immediate military action and cannot wait for a formal declaration of war. There may be some actions where there might be a need for the president to commit troops, but not at the same level or scope as actually a full-scale war. So that's why the president says as commander-in-chief they have the right to do this. But how far they go and how many troops and how much time they spend overseas, and at what point does a military or police action really become a war? And so that's why Congress wanted to make sure that it was able to reassert its authority by passing over Nixon's veto the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And also other presidents, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush and President Clinton have all taken military actions that they did not report to Congress under the War Powers Resolution. And the presidents often have looked at the War Powers Resolution, in fact, as an infringement on their right to exercise their responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief. Now, another point I want to say in terms of the powers of the president, and this, well, actually, this is actually a good point to talk to move beyond our discussion of the powers of the president. But one thing I do want to say in terms of how the president's power has grown over time, for most of the course of our history, the presidency was much weaker than it is today. And during the time of our founding, the time our Constitution was ratified, I mean, the real intention was that the Congress would be the dominant institution, the president would be secondary. And it really was not until about the 1930s that the presidency began to grow in power and scope and importance and become much more powerful, to the point now today the presidency as an institution is really more powerful than the Congress as an institution. And certainly the president over any one member of Congress is much more powerful. Now, this goes back to the 1930s, and I think about why this happened and goes back to the 1930s. Basically, the power of the presidency corresponded with the rise of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy grew, the federal government grew, the federal departments and agencies grew, but really began to take off in the 1930s with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 and his New Deal. President Roosevelt recommended the creation of several new agencies to deal with the Depression, such as the Social Security Agency, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So a string of agencies were created to deal with unemployment and trying to get our economy back on track. So the bureaucracy began to grow, and it really began to take off back during the 1930s as part of the New Deal. And certainly that continued on in World War II, because when we were required to meet and respond to the threats of Adolf Hitler and the axis that was created between Italy and Japan and Germany. And so to deal with that and our involvement in World War II, that again led to growing expenditures in defense. And if you think about since that period of time with the Cold War, all of these precipitated the need to enhance our power, as we projected our power overseas as well, becoming a strong military power. All of these things together led to the rise of bureaucracy. So if we go back to the 1930s or so and do a graph and see how the agencies have grown over that period of time, and to the point even today, even going back to the 1960s with the creation of agencies such as Department of Health and Education and Welfare, which is today's Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. All of these types of agencies that were created all the way from the 30s on up to more modern times, the Department of Homeland Security. As bureaucracy has grown in size, in scope, and importance, then the power of the presidency has grown in size, in scope, and importance. Because, after all, the president is the chief executive, and that basically means that he is the head of all of these agencies. All these agencies, the department secretaries, report to the president and are appointed by the president. So, what I want to suggest to you is that the rise of the presidency corresponded, as an institution in terms of power, that corresponded with the rise of bureaucracy because of the president being head of the bureaucracy. Now today, what does this mean in terms of this powerful presidency? It means today that our presidents are surrounded by hundreds of advisors, and they sit on top of this huge bureaucracy of some 3 million people and another 1.7 million members of the armed forces. So obviously the president has a lot of power at his disposal. So the president has the power to send troops overseas, to commit us to a nuclear war, and I think short of Bill Gates, I think a lot of people would argue that the president is probably the most powerful person in the world. It is interesting to note, however, that the presidents have often complained of their inability to run the bureaucracy and in general get things done. And so even though they're on top of this massive unwieldy bureaucracy, the fact that it is hard sometimes for them the minute they want something changed, sometimes it takes some time for it to change. And so they've claimed and been frustrated by that at times. Now, what I want to do, we're going to save our discussion of bureaucracy as another topic, but I do want to look more closely at other components of the executive branch. And specifically, I want to look at the White House staff, the executive office of the president, the cabinet, and the role of the vice president as well. So first of all, let's look at the White House staff. The White House staff is the personal staff that oversees the president's political and policy agenda. These are people who helped get the president elected and who play a key role in helping craft his agenda. These include communication directors, speech writers, the president's chief of staff. For example, under Barack Obama, the chief of staff was Rahm Emanuel. One of his major players in helping him get elected, campaign advisors, was David Axelrod, and now he's part of the White House staff. There's examples of others, but these are close advisors to the president who play a major role in helping him write speeches and helping him get things done and interfacing with Congress, a lot of different important positions there. Now, there are different ways in which the presidents, in terms of their management style, have organized their staffs in the past. And some of the texts talk about two different ways in particular, a pyramid style and a wheel or a circular style. And basically the difference between the two is under a pyramid method, you have assistants to the president report through a hierarchy to the chief of staff. And so presidents like Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan use this method. Presidents Clinton and Carter to some degree use this after a time, experimenting with the circular method. But basically the idea behind the pyramid method is that it provides an efficient, orderly flow of information. And so if it gives a lot of power, the disadvantage perhaps is it gives a lot of power to the chief of staff, because basically it may discourage some communication flow, and it may lead to misinformation and isolation. In other words, if the president is relying upon just one or two people like the chief of staff to deal with everything else that's going on in the executive in the White House staff, that may actually lead to giving a little too much power to the chief of staff. And again, they filter information through that chief of staff to the president, so it may actually, again, give the chief of staff may only tell the president what he wants him to hear, and therefore it may discourage negative communication, and again may lead to some misinformation and isolation. But on the other hand, it can promote the efficient, orderly flow of information. Now, the wheel method or circular method, by contrast, is a little bit different. It basically means that the president has an open door policy, and as a management style is open to any of his top assistants can come in and talk to him, and it basically provides the president a wider access or a wider source of information. But on the other hand, it comes at a cost too, because it creates, the price in this case was confusion and conflict among assistants. Again, President Carter and Clinton started this way, but sometimes it slows or bogs down the decision-making process, and so in essence, decision-making becomes more cumbersome. So essentially what many presidents have adopted is some hybrid between the two, trying to find a balance between to achieve the advantages of a pyramid structure on the one hand, but also making sure that the information and the richness of information is provided through more of a wheel or circular method as well. So trying to provide some type of hybrid between those two is obviously the optimal way of trying to organize your staff. Now, besides your White House staff, these are your close inner circle of advisors. And again, largely these people are those who help play a key role in getting you elected. Besides those individuals, then you have, let's pull out and go into a little bit further out in terms of a concentric circle here. You have what's called the Executive Office of the President. The Executive Office of the President is not an office, but really it's a series of agencies, large agencies in fact, that help the President and report directly to the President, perform services for the President. And these are not located in the White House itself. Some of these agencies, again, are rather large bureaucracies. Some of the more prominent agencies found within the Executive Office of the President include OMB, that is the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S. Trade Representative, which again is really one person but also a huge bureaucracy on top of that, and also the National Security Council. The CIA, the NSC, and the OMB are probably three of the most important ones that we hear about. And for example, the role of the Office of Management and Budget is particularly important because the OMB is heavily involved in the budget preparation, overseeing the whole preparation of the President's budget from all the agencies. We're not going to go into all the detail about how the budgets are created by all the agencies, but bottom line is this, is that each agency's budget, each federal department's budget has to have the approval of the Office of Management and Budget before the President signs off on that budget request. And before that budget goes to the Congress, OMB has the opportunity to go through that President's budget, which reflects all the accumulated individual separate budgets of the various departments and agencies. OMB oversees that process to make sure that the budget requests and projections are in line with the President's agenda and policies, prerogatives, expectations, and so forth. So the OMB plays a key role there. But the OMB also plays a key role in terms of overseeing the management of all the different departments and agencies too. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Before any new regulation comes out from any federal agency, it is required, the OMB requires that agency to conduct a cost-benefit analysis, or at least in most cases, to conduct a cost-benefit analysis to make sure that the benefits of this regulation exceed the cost to society. And the agencies have to report these results to the OMB, and before these agency regulations are issued, the OMB will often weigh in on whether or not to approve these regulations going forward or not going forward. So the OMB plays a very, very big role. And as I talked about Congress before, Congress has a Congressional Budget Office, which is like a huge bureaucracy to assist Congress in its analysis of the President's budget. Well, the CBO is to Congress, as an analogy, is what the OMB is to the President. And it's again, it's a very huge bureaucracy to oversee the budget preparation process as well as the management issues that are going on across the federal departments and agencies. So you've got the OMB playing a major role. Obviously, the National Security Council, which is comprised of the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and many assistants. The National Security Council plays a key role in advising the President and keeping the President updated on national security issues and breaking events that are happening that have an impact on national security. That would also include, by the way, the Secretary of Homeland Security as well. Now, besides the NSC, there's also other agencies that are part of the Executive Office of the President, but we'll move on here. Let's talk about the Cabinet. The Cabinet is comprised of the heads of each of the 15 major departments. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, Justice, Commerce, Agriculture, Interior, Transportation, Education, Veterans Affairs, so forth. There's what scholars have called an inner and outer cabinet. The inner cabinet tends to be comprised of the Attorney General, the head of the Department of Justice, who is the head of the Department of Justice, along with the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury, and increasingly Homeland Security. The outer cabinet is comprised of other departmental secretaries such as Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Interior, Labor, Agriculture, Commerce, and Transportation. So you have an inner cabinet, closer advisors, and an outer cabinet. But the bottom line here is that the cabinets don't play that effective of an advisory role. It's part of the institutional presidency. And again, when we talk about bureaucracy, we're really going to be talking a lot more about the agencies over which the cabinet's members are heads of. But as an advisory body, they don't play nearly the role as members of the White House staff and certainly some of the key agencies with respect to the Executive Office of the President. So anyway, so we have as part of the institutional presidency, just make sure that we have a good understanding of this now. The institutional presidency includes the White House staff, we've got that, the Executive Office of the President, we've got the Cabinet. Now the last major component of the institutional presidency is the Vice President. And the Vice President, according to the Constitution, the only job of the Vice President is to serve as the presiding officer of the Senate. that is, the President of the Senate. And even here, the Vice President has no votes unless there is the need to break a tie. Interestingly, a lot of the Vice Presidents have complained, even though many of them have gone on to become President, Vice Presidents typically complain about the mediocrity of their role. In fact, it reminds me of what one Vice President said. John Nance Garner, who was Vice President under FDR, said that the Vice Presidency could be compared to, quote, a warm bucket of spit. But the question is how have Vice Presidents performed over time, and what have they done, and what have we seen most recently? Well, basically I can say probably in the last 25 years or so, many of the Vice Presidents have played a little bit increasing role. Many of them have chaired task forces or sitting on advisory panels. When President Reagan was in office, George H.W. Bush's Vice President chaired the President's task force on regulatory reform, trying to come up with a set of recommendations to reduce the degree of regulation and and overall size of bureaucracy. Under President George H.W. Bush, his Vice President was Dan Quayle, and Dan Quayle didn't play much of a role as Vice President. I think one of the more notable ones was that he headed up a commission that dealt with space exploration. Vice President Al Gore, under President Clinton, served as chair of a task force designed to reinvent government, and under that, his task force came up with a number of ways to reduce red tape throughout government and to reduce the size of government. And but again, ultimately, the Vice Presidency is seen as a job without a lot of power. Oftentimes, they may go and represent the President overseas in foreign meetings. If someone overseas, a foreign dignitary, passes away, maybe the Vice President will attend the funeral in the President's absence, things like that. Now, I will say most recently that Vice President Cheney, probably more than any other Vice President, took one of the most active roles in expanding the scope and power and prerogatives of the office of the Vice Presidency. And in fact, a lot of people criticize Vice President Cheney because of his very, very strong and significant influence in the Bush administration's, during the time of the Bush administration. Vice President Cheney commandeered, in fact, for example, separate intelligence gathering operations and staffs reporting through directly to him in his own staff as a counterpart to existing intelligence gathering operations that were part of the National Security Council and traditional Department of Defense, State, CIA, and the FBI. Now, one thing I'll say, so that takes care of our discussion in terms of the institutional presidency. Now, one of the things I think it's important to also talk about in terms of an asset or a liability available to the President is his degree of popularity. The President, if a President who's popular can get a lot done, and he can exercise the office as a, quote, a bully pit to get Congress, to spur Congress to action. And if he's popular, the Congress will often go along with that. The President can use the media to his advantage. We talked about that earlier before in terms of how the President can exert a significant influence over the media to promote his policy and political agenda. But one particular asset in terms of popularity or one particular asset that he has available is his popularity and the degree of it. And he obviously has a better chance of getting bills through Congress if he has high popularity ratings than those that are low. What generally happens, and this is kind of interesting over time, is that when a president is first elected, he tends to be high in terms of approval ratings. The people tend to approve him. He may be popular when he first gets elected. And so there may be a short honeymoon period when the president may be able to get a lot of legislation through Congress, and he needs to take advantage of that. Really, during his first 100 days or so, if you were an advisor to the president, one of the things that you would tell the president is to make sure to try to craft and get as much through Congress as he possibly could during that first 100 days, or at least at the first year of his presidency, especially because over time his popularity may begin to wane, and as that happens, it may become more difficult to get his agenda accomplished. What happens again over time is that his popularity typically does begin to decline. we begin, after about 2 years into the presidential cycle, we have what's called midterm congressional elections. And what begins to happen about that time is that maybe some campaign promises go unrealized. Maybe the economy is going bad, not performing up to shape. Maybe there's some promises that the president had committed to and has backed off on some of those promises, alienating some of the voters out there. And because of that decline, what happens here is that that translates in sometimes midterm congressional elections will often tend to favor the party that is not in power at the White House. In fact, since World War II, the party holding the White House has lost an average of 27 seats in midterm congressional elections. Okay, so a lot of times then, the party not in power at the White House will actually come back into power, or at least be strengthened during the midterm congressional elections, and in part because the popularity of the president's beginning to wane. Now, along the same lines of what I think all this underscores is that I think we as citizens give the president way too much credit when things go well and way too much blame when things don't go well, because there's a lot of factors that are really beyond the power of the president that influence the economy, for example. But nonetheless, we see that happening over time, and then let's say the president, after beyond those 2 years into the third and fourth year, if the president gets reelected, there will be a sudden renewal of his popularity, but often it's short-lived. And then after that following 2 years or so, he becomes known as what's called a lame duck, and then doesn't command a whole lot of power. And the members of Congress, even the members of his own party, are feel less inclined to go along with his agenda. Now, besides this, another topic I want to talk about here is the idea of impeaching the president. When can you impeach the president, and what is impeachment? Now, impeachment is a very serious charge. The Constitution says that a president can be impeached in instances where he has committed treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And but what's important to understand is that impeachment is not removal of the president. Impeachment is pretty much analogous to the idea of indictment. Enough evidence has been brought before you and to suggest that you should be removed from office. And then what happens basically is this, is that only the House can bring impeachment proceedings against a president, and it only requires a majority vote. So if the House, by a majority, and if they vote party lines, one party, the opposite party is controlling the House, a mere majority can vote to impeach the president. And that happened, for example, with Bill Clinton back in the 1990s. And if the House votes to impeach by just a mere majority, then at that point, basically what that is saying is that we have enough evidence to suggest that because, for example, if you lied under oath or committed perjury, we're going to now invoke the Senate to try you and have hearings with the possible outcome of removing you from office. So if the House votes to impeach, the president will be tried by the Senate, and the presiding officer of these proceedings will be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice will preside over this. Now, in this case, for the Senate to agree and say that yes, the evidence is sufficient and we're going to remove the president from office requires a 2/3 vote. A 2/3 of a vote in the Senate is required to remove the president from office. Okay? So if a president is impeached, does not mean he's removed. Only if the Senate votes after a trial, and considering all the evidence, and after a 2/3 vote of the Senate, would a president then be officially removed from office. Now, I think what we'll do in terms of our last bit of material, let's talk about, since we've been talking about the chief executive at the federal level, let's now move a bit down to the state and talk about the Missouri executive, and of course, this case, the Missouri governor, and talk a little bit about the different powers of the governor and the comparison between the governor and the president, and also a comparison between, say, the institutional presidency and the institutions available in Missouri to serve the governor. First of all, as part of the executive branch of Missouri. First of all, it's important to understand how many years the governor can be elected, and that is for 4 years. And how many terms does the governor serve? 2 years. And of course, that's just like the president. Now, the governor, like the president, has the power to veto bills that are submitted by the legislature. And like the president, the veto power is a very important power because it's very difficult to override a governor's veto. In fact, an even less percentage of the governor's bills have ever been overridden in Missouri's history. So the threat of a governor's veto is a very powerful threat. Now, unlike the president, the governor does have the power of the line item vetoes we've talked about. So he can cut out certain kinds of spending in an appropriations bill while preserving the policies or programs or the spending levels that he wants. And that, of course, gives him considerable power. And most governors across the nation do have the line item veto power because of oftentimes state constitutional requirements to balance their budget. And that applies, of course, here to Missouri as well. Now, the governor cannot use the line item on veto power on items related to public education. Okay, there is some restrictions according to the Constitution here in Missouri. If the governor does not like the money that's being appropriated in terms of education, that is secondary and elementary public education, he cannot use the line item on those kinds of issues. Nor can he use the line item on payment or on items relating to payment of Missouri's public debt. Okay, so on those issues, those are off the table according to the Constitution that prevent the governor from using line item veto power on those things. But on other things, he certainly can. Now, like the president has the power to pardon, and the president can grant, can also reduce sentences and those kinds of things. Well, the Missouri governor has these same kinds of judicial or quasi-judicial powers. The Missouri governor can grant a stay of execution. The Missouri governor can pardon someone who has committed a state crime. The Missouri governor can reduce somebody's sentence, and that's called commuting a sentence, to reduce the penalty or severity of a sentence or the time of a sentence. That's called commutation, or to commute a sentence. Like the president's commander-in-chief role, the Missouri governor is commander-in-chief of the National Guard. This is the state militia. The Missouri governor has the right to activate the Guard to preserve order here in Missouri, such as during times of national disaster. He can call out the Guard and activate the Guard to deal with these kinds of problems. Now, the next in line of the governor is the lieutenant governor, and the lieutenant governor also serves 4-year terms. But what's interesting about the lieutenant governor is that the lieutenant governor runs a separate election from the governor. This is fascinating. What this basically means is that the lieutenant governor can serve as many 4-year terms as they can be elected. There are no term limits on the lieutenant governor. There are on the governor, but not on the lieutenant governor. And what's even more fascinating to me is that the lieutenant governor does not even have to be of the same party as the governor. Okay, so you think of, for example, Peter Kinder, a Republican, Jay Nixon, governor, is Democrat. Now, the lieutenant governor does not have a lot of power. Their principal job, like the vice president, is to preside over the state senate. Okay, it's more ceremonial than anything else. The lieutenant governor really does not have much power beyond that in the state senate, or anything. But they will be next in line should something happen to the governor. And sometimes too, the lieutenant governor will use their position as a platform to run eventually as governor one day. Now, besides the governor and the lieutenant governor, there is a secretary of state, and this person is very different from the secretary of state at the federal level. The secretary of state at the federal level, of course, is involved in chairing, heading over the Department of State, the State Department, and overseeing all of our ambassadors and our foreign policy. In this case, the Secretary of State of Missouri basically oversees a lot of state regulations, publishes state regulations, does a lot of paperwork like handling corporations, registering corporations, handling the paperwork for people running for state elections. They maintain official state records. The Secretary of State can be reelected over and over again, And interestingly, the Secretary of State is actually paid more than the Lieutenant Governor. And then other positions, and these are people who run for office independently. They're not appointed by the governor. These include the auditor, the treasurer, and the attorney general. The auditor, for example, is responsible for conducting audits, that is financial reviews of state governments throughout Missouri. For example, the auditor could come to Missouri State University and conduct an audit of Missouri government. The state auditor could actually even audit local and city government, various city governments and county governments as well, at the request of individuals in those areas. The treasurer basically is the keeper of the funds and maintains the treasury of the state, the flow of funds coming in and going out of Missouri. And then the attorney general, which plays a role in terms of prosecutorial role and has a number of functions here that are judicial in nature here in Missouri. And then besides these individuals, you also have 16 major state departments, and many of these state departments, as part of the state government in Jeff City, are run by independent boards and commissions. And that is, they're not appointed by a governor per se, but they're independent boards and commissions. The governor does have influence, but it also makes these departments somewhat free from the governor's control. So the boards may be appointed by the governor, but they in turn appoint the heads of these departments. So the heads of these departments are insulated from the direct control of the governor. Okay, so I think this is probably a good time to wrap our discussion up on the presidency and the Missouri governor. What we'll be doing in our next discussion will be our next topic will be the bureaucracy. We'll be talking about the bureaucracy in much more detail and talking about how we set our bureaucracy up, what's good about our bureaucracy, what's bad about our bureaucracy. So that'll be again our next topic of material. So for now, this is Patrick Scott, and we'll see you next time.